Hi everybody, just waiting for the last few people to join and then we'll get started. Right, I'll get started now, and then if there's any kind of people that are still joining, we can catch up with us in a little bit later on. So good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all safe and well and coping okay given the current situation. First of all, I just really want to take the opportunity to say thank you for joining me for today's session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Natasha Oakley. I'm a consultant at ATG Health and Safety Consultants. I have 10 years experience in the health and safety industry, and my background is predominantly in construction. However, I've worked across a broad range of industry sectors, including manufacturing, retail, facilities management and hospitality. Fortunately, I haven't quite branched out yet into the world of technology, so fingers crossed everything goes okay for today's webinar. Hopefully you should be able to see me at the on your screen, as well as the slides for today's session. And just before I get started, I just want to mention, if you do have any questions in relation to any of the content as I'm going through the webinar today, or if there's any other issues that are relevant to any of today's session, feel free to drop a question in the Q&A box, and we've allocated some time at the end of this session to answer those questions. Please do use the Q&A box instead of the chat function if you can, just because it makes it easier to manage all of your questions and we can see who's got questions. And before I kind of jump into the webinar, I'd just like to briefly introduce ATG for those of you who haven't come across us before. We're a team of health and safety consultants, and we provide health and safety support services to a broad range of organisations throughout the UK. And most of those are predominantly based in the Northwest. Our consultants have a broad range of industry specialisations, allowing us to ensure that we are able to provide suitable levels of expertise to effectively support each individual organisations that we work with. We offer a broad range of consultancy services, including general advice and guidance to ensure compliance with legal requirements. And we also offer policy and health and safety management system implementation and audits, guidance on the completion of risk assessments, and when necessary, we assist organisations in doing them, and a whole host of other support services really to allow the effective implementation of an effective health and safety management system for organisations. We also offer our own training and bespoke training packages for all of our clients, and these can be delivered either by face-to-face e-learning or traditional classroom-based methods, as well as IASH accredited training such as managing safely and leading safely. Obviously, in recent weeks, the workplace has changed quite rapidly for a lot of organisations, and businesses have faced an unprecedented number of demands and challenges in relation to their existing working arrangements. So we've been working closely with our clients to provide kind of practical advice, guidance and solutions to allow them to continue to operate as seamlessly as possible where they can, given the current situation. And what we've been trying to do is provide kind of a holistic approach to the advice and guidance that we've been giving people. So alongside Maxon's HR teams, we've been providing regular guidance, updates, guidance notes, templates and the like for organisations via email to our subscribed clients to make sure that they're kept in the loop. And we've also kept businesses up to date with a coronavirus business hub that has allowed everybody to access up-to-date industry guidance from a wide range of experts. We've also recently developed a home worker portal, which is a system that's allowed organisations to remotely manage home workers, including the facility to undertake risk assessments and train workers that are working from home. And this webinar is the second in the part of our three-part health and safety series. So we've previously addressed issues around home worker safety, and today we'll be looking at how you can continue to operate safely as a business given the current circumstances. And our third webinar and the final one in the series on the 21st of May will be in relation to issues about getting back to work safely. And will be particularly useful for any organisations that are looking for a phased return to work following the anticipated easing of restrictions on the 1st of June. And we'll look into a little bit further detail into kind of the safety considerations of having to bring premises back into operation, as well as ensuring staff who may have been furloughed or off work for a significant amount of time are able to safely return to work. But anyway, on with today's session. There's quite a lot of information that we need to cover in light of the new guidance that's been issued by the government this week in relation to how businesses should be managing their COVID-19 risks. So I'm going to jump in and get started. I'm going to be disappearing from your screens now, but hopefully you should still be able to see the slides. So if you do have any issues or anything goes wrong, just pop a note in the chat box and be able to sort it out for you. So anyway, today's session is going to be split into 4 parts. So today, the first, we'll look at how you can make sure that your business is COVID secure and what this actually means in practice and how you can go about achieving this. Then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the additional health and safety issues that you might need to consider as a result of any COVID-19 measures that have been introduced within the work, within your business. And then we'll go on to look at the health and safety executives' approach to enforcement at this time. So this will include their approach in dealing with non-compliance, specifically in related to COVID-19 mitigation measures, and as well as their overall approach into the enforcement of general health and safety related matters during this time. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we'll finish up with a Q&A session. We're anticipating quite a few questions today, so we'll get through as many as we can and then make sure that we follow up any unanswered questions after the webinar. So for organisations then that are kind of continuing to operate through this period, what are the kind of health and safety management considerations that they need to think about? Well, it is paramount that businesses who are continuing to operate are managing their work activities in such a manner to protect their workforce and take all possible steps to mitigate the risks posed by COVID-19 in their workplace. So, as I'm sure you'll all be aware, the government has issued kind of quite a bit of guidance earlier this week and has set out the key steps that organisations should be taking to ensure that their workplaces are meeting the correct health and safety standards. These standards are now being dubbed COVID secure, and this is the term that the government is using to kind of make sure that organisations are meeting that safety standard. And to help organisations understand what this means, the government in conjunction with the HSE have set out a 5-step approach that organisations should be taking to ensure that they are able to meet this standard. So they've produced a poster that organisations are being encouraged to display within their workplaces, which allows them to demonstrate that they've taken all reasonable steps to mitigate COVID-19 risks in the workplace. And a copy of this can be downloaded from the HSE website and used as part of your COVID-19 strategy. So when we are talking about making your business COVID secure, what should businesses be thinking about, and what does this actually mean? So the government set out this 5-step approach, and the first step in that approach is the guidance remains that if work can be done from home and you can work from home, then employers should be taking all reasonable steps to facilitate employees working from home where this is possible. If employees can't work from home, if your employees can't work from home and your business is permitted to be open, then your first port of call is a risk assessment. So employers are legally required to undertake a suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to the health and safety faced by their employees at work under the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. And this now includes risks that are posed by coronavirus. So risk assessments that cover exposure to COVID-19 will be very, very different from one organisation to another. So for instance, healthcare workers, workers in retail, utility engineers and construction workers will all have a very different exposure to this risk. But in general, the approach to a risk assessment is a systematic process of identifying the hazards and evaluating any associated risks within a workplace, and then implementing reasonable control measures to remove or reduce the hazards that you've identified. So this process should be adopted when you undertake a COVID-19 risk assessment. So the first thing that you should do is critically evaluate your workplace and your work activities and identify what activities or situations might cause transmission of the virus. You'll also need to think about who could be at risk and how likely it is that they're exposed. And then there's certain key things that you will need to consider, which include, while your employees are at work, how likely is that it is that they're going to be exposed to other people with the virus. If they're coming in contact with members of the public or visitors or other employees, how frequently they're likely to come into contact with other people that potentially have the virus, how long for, and in what environment is this happening. So is it indoors in a confined space in somebody's house, for example, or is it maybe outdoors where the risk of transmission is a little bit lower? You'll also need to think about how employees might travel to work and how they might be exposed in those situations. So are they having to use public transport, or do they come in their own vehicle? And also, how do you know which employees have medical conditions which might make them more vulnerable to and susceptible to the virus? Obviously, any of those employees that have been kind of encouraged to shield themselves should be actively encouraged to do so by you as an employer. However, there will be some employees that aren't necessarily needing to shield, but still might have medical conditions that might actually make them more susceptible. So those types of people will need to be considered as well. And then another consideration is kind of looking at any employees where they might have people in their household who may pose an increased exposure, who might have an increased exposure to the disease. So do you have any employees that have got healthcare workers living within their household that may be on the front line that are potentially in contact with the virus on a daily, regular basis? And once you have answers to these questions, you're then able to make better informed decisions as to kind of the measures that you need to adopt in order to control the risk. So control measures in relation to coronavirus will be heavily centred at the moment around maintaining social distancing and ensuring that suitable hygiene and cleaning measures can be implemented and maintained. And so when you are thinking about what control measures are needed, organisations will need to really carefully consider how each area of the workplace and any work activities might need to be modified in order to reduce the level of exposure to risk. So this might involve changing the physical layout of the workspace, for example, or introducing or modifying any existing working arrangements or procedures to accommodate the new implementation of these control measures. And in order to understand, to help businesses understand what measures they need to take, the government has actually issued further detailed specific industry guidance in relation to the particular control measures that can be introduced in particular industry settings. And this guidance should really be being used during your risk assessment process to guide the decisions in relation to the control measures that you as an organisation should be implementing. As a quick side note, the recommendations that are contained within the guidance are not legal requirements. However, the HSE has enforced the full implementation of the government guidance wherever possible. And it's very likely that this guidance will be used as the benchmark when considering enforcement action following an inspection, for example. So for organisations who decide that they do not want to implement some of the recommendations that have been outlined in the guidance, they would need to be able to demonstrate that the alternative measures that they've implemented are better than or equal to the recommended measures that the government are saying should be in place. For anybody who is struggling with completing a risk assessment or deciding what measures they might need to introduce, we do have support packages available to help organisations with this. So feel free to drop me a line after this webinar if you've still got some questions or you're not really sure about how to go about the risk assessment process. So the third point in the government 5-step approach, so after staying at home if you can, and then carrying out a risk assessment, is to maintain a 2-metre social distancing wherever possible. And this will be one of your key control measures in mitigating COVID-19 risks in the workplace. So again, the specific measures that organisations will be required to implement will vary according to a wide range of different factors. So this will include kind of the industry that you're working in, the work activities that you undertake, and the existing environment in which those activities are being undertaken. But generally speaking, it's likely that the following factors are going to require some consideration within your existing work environment. So, you know, do you need to rearrange workstations to keep people 2 metres apart from each other? Can you mark out areas using tape or floor paint and using signage to help people maintain a 2-metre distance? And this is especially important around communal areas and assets, so things such as photocopiers or that type of thing, where a lot of people use on a day-to-day basis, making sure that there's suitable arrangements for maintaining distances in those situations is very important. Are you able to minimise the number of people in the workplace or minimise the number of people using communal areas at any one time to make sure that the 2-metre distances can be maintained? And measures might include changing shift patterns, staggering start or finish times or break times. Do you need to introduce any temporary pedestrian walkways or one-way systems so that you're managing the interaction of people crossing paths? Do you need to consider any additional access or egress arrangements? So the introduction of any queuing systems, dedicated entrances, exits, you know, limiting how many people use use lifts at any one time. You do have a limit on the number of people that are allowed to be confined in the lift space. And then again, how are you going to manage access and what restrictions are you going to put in place for social distancing in common welfare areas such as canteens, staff rest areas, toilets, kitchens, copying rooms? All those types of things will need to be considered. And maintaining a 2-metre social distancing at all times should be a priority. And it's really, really important that when you're undertaking this risk assessment approach and looking at these control measures, that all aspects of the business operations are reviewed so you can ensure that this takes place. And thinking about all those little bits of activity that might not necessarily form a key part of the business operations, but is likely to kind of have an effect on being able to maintain that 2-metre distance. So once you've done your risk assessment procedure, it may have identified that there are potential situations where people cannot be 2 meters apart. And if you have identified those types of situations within either your work areas or during work activities that you have to undertake, it's really important that transmission risk is managed effectively in those situations. And so when you're thinking about these types of activities, your first consideration in such circumstances should be whether or not that activity is critical to business operations. If it is, then really you should be looking to see if there are any ways that you can modify the working procedures in any way to remove the need for people to be in close proximity. So for example, if you have manual handling activities, for example, that would normally require 2 people, can you source any lifting aids, or can you mechanise the process in any way to make sure that that activity can now be undertaken safely by a single individual? If there are essential activities that do require individuals to work in close proximity, there are a number of measures that organisations can take to reduce the level of risk. And these include things such as installing barriers and screens in shared spaces, minimising the number of workers involved in these tasks. So this could be by creating workplace shift patterns that minimise the number of people that are in contact with each other, or grouping people into fixed teams that don't kind of mingle with each other to make sure that that contact is again minimised. Are you able to minimise face-to-face contact in situations where people have to work in close proximity? So can the activity be carried out working back to back or side by side, for example? If that's not possible, are you able to change the working procedures in any way to minimise the frequency and duration of any face-to-face contact that might be required? And one of the final considerations in such circumstances will be whether you need to provide employees with any additional PPE in these situations. And when you are considering this, each activity will need to be risk assessed thoroughly, ensuring that you're using the hierarchy of controls and that you are using any sector-specific guidance in relation to the activity that you're doing. The other thing that you'll need to be mindful of is that masks and other types of PPE are often considered the last resort in the hierarchy of control. So really you should be looking at implementing any other measures that you can before you default to using PPE as a protective measure. The final step then in the 5-step approach to ensuring the business is COVID secure is considering the cleaning and hygiene procedures that will need to be put in place. So this will be particularly important in areas where a 2-metre social distance cannot be maintained, or if you've got areas of high traffic and shared use. And implementing robust cleaning procedures with particular focus on high contact areas such as doors, buttons, handles, any shared tools or equipment is really, really important. If you can avoid any sharing of equipment where possible, then that would be ideal. But where this can't be avoided, you should ensure that there are suitable cleaning regimes in place for those items of equipment. And in order to ensure that cleaning regimes are effectively implemented and maintained, you will need to adequately plan what cleaning procedures need to be implemented, who needs to implement them, and how you will ensure suitable cleaning equipment and materials remain readily available. As well as introducing enhanced cleaning regimes, you will also need to ensure that suitable hygiene practices can be observed by your workers. So you'll need to introduce things like allowing regular breaks to allow employees to wash their hands, displaying signage around the workplace that highlight the hygiene measures that staff should adhere to, and actively encouraging your staff to adhere to those measures. You should be making sure that there's suitable hand washing stations available, and in areas where you think there may be more, providing pop-up stations if you can. And this could be using hand sanitizer where hand washing stations, full water and soap stations aren't available. And again, there is now specific industry guidance, which is fairly detailed in relation to the cleaning and hygiene procedures that can be implemented in a variety of different settings. So really it is worth kind of having a look at that guidance that is relevant to your industry sector, and making sure that you're able to kind of follow that guidance. So in a nutshell then, that really is that 5-step approach that outlines how organisations should be approaching becoming COVID secure, and the approach that they should be taking in order to manage COVID-19 risks within the workplace. And the things that should be considered before bringing any of the workforce back into the workplace. So ensuring that you've critically evaluated the potential implementation of these 5 measures and detailed the control measures that you are going to adopt in the workplace as part of a risk assessment procedure will allow you to effectively demonstrate that you've taken appropriate steps in your workplace to make sure that it is COVID secure. In addition to those measures and those 5 steps to making sure that your business is COVID secure, there are a number of other essential issues that you will need to kind of consider in order to ensure that you're able to continue your work activities safely whilst implementing the new COVID control measures. And I just want to go on now and spend a little bit of time looking at those key issues now. So one of the first things that you'll need to consider is that, do any of the changes in the shift patterns or the reduced numbers of staff mean that your existing emergency arrangements are affected? And there are a few key issues that you will need to be considering here. So, for example, are there a suitable number of fire wardens and first aiders available during all the periods that the business is operational? If you do need to change any emergency procedures, you'll need to make sure that anybody who is given a new responsibility for any aspect of the emergency procedures is given suitable training and information about their roles and responsibilities and what they should be doing in emergency situations. And again, obviously, all employees will need to then be told, provided with the right kind of information in relation to the new or modified arrangements in place. So if there's new contacts or new arrangements in place, they will need to be fully briefed on the arrangements that have been put in place to maintain their kind of safety in those situations. As well as your emergency arrangements, you'll also need to kind of make sure that there are suitable numbers of staff available to ensure that safety critical activities can continue and remain safe, as well as ensuring that any kind of supervisory arrangements still remain adequate to ensure the safety of the workforce, and that there's adequate supervision there to make sure that people are actually adhering to the guidelines and the procedures that have been put in place. And another key consideration for organisations that are maybe implementing split shifts and things like that now, where they haven't done that previously, is how are you going to hand over safety critical information at shift changes to make sure that any kind of issues that have been highlighted in the previous shift are adequately communicated to managers and employees that are now working on the following shift, to make sure that any kind of faults with any machines or any key safety critical information is adequately communicated and passed down that chain. Another thing that you will need to consider is whether any new hazards have been introduced by the new or modified working procedures that you've put in place. So for instance, are there any potential lone working situations where staff are working in isolation for prolonged periods? And if they are, how will you manage the safety and maybe emergency ill health situations that might arise in such situations? Is there a potential for staff to be exposed to an increased level of aggression or violence in customer-facing roles, for example? Or are staff now required to undertake any manual handling tasks or any other tasks which usually require 2 persons working together for safety reasons? And if that is the case, what measures now need to be introduced to make sure that that activity can safely be carried out by 1 person? An easy way to do this will be to pull out your existing risk assessments that relate to your existing work activities and workplace, and review those and check that they still remain relevant to the work activities that are being undertaken in line with the new measures that you've introduced. If there are any changes, these risk assessments should be amended when necessary. And finally, you'll also need to consider the impact or the potential impact of the lack of routine inspection, testing or maintenance regime on the safety of any of the work equipment and your building premises. So have any of the current restrictions had an impact on existing schemes of testing and inspection or maintenance procedures? And if so, what measures are you taking to ensure that equipment remains safe? I'll talk a little bit later on about the HSE's current enforcement approach in relation to issues in completing statutory inspections as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. However, employers still have a duty to ensure that all equipment remains safe to use. Again, businesses should be ensuring that building services, so things like your fire detection systems, emergency lighting and firefighting equipment has been maintained effectively and remain fully operational. As well as looking at aspects such as water hygiene management and Legionella risks to make sure that employees aren't going to be exposed to any risk arising out of safety of the building services. Next week's webinar will kind of explore this in a little bit more detail, and the measures should be taken, you know, if you're bringing premises back into operation after a period of shutdown. So if that does apply to your organisation, then it's definitely worth booking onto next week's webinar for a little bit more detail about that. And then a final key consideration that will be vital in the success of the implementation of the measures that we've been talking about is ensuring that you actively communicate and consult with your employees in relation to the measures that you're taking in order to manage the COVID-19 risks within the workplace. So employees should really be actively encouraged to contribute their own ideas in relation to the areas and activities that they consider to be high risk, and you know, be allowed to give their contribution as to what actions that they think can be taken to mitigate the risk that they've identified. Ideally, employees should try to move from a more traditional approach to health and safety, which tends to be focused around compliance, to an approach that actually aims to engage, educate, and explain and encourage staff to have an input into the overall health and safety management of coronavirus risks. And ensuring that you have these two-way open channels of communication where employees are able to raise concerns and influence decisions on managing health and safety will help to reassure them that their health and safety is being taken seriously. And we generally see, in terms of general health and safety, that where organisations have adopted this approach in terms of their general health and safety management, they tend to find that employees are much more likely to be engaged in terms of health and safety, and as a result the management systems are actually a lot more effective and work a lot better, because the employees kind of feel valued and a lot more willing to go along with the procedures that have been implemented. And transparency with regards to kind of the health and safety measures that are in place will also be key in helping staff members feel less anxious and worried about returning to work. And a return to work induction or handbook or something similar that you can provide to staff upon return to the workplace will help to ease your staff back into work and allow you to clearly communicate that to them the steps that you've taken, the health and safety steps that you've taken to keep them healthy and safe at work, and then also give them information about the procedures that they will be required to follow in order to help you make sure that the measures that you've implemented are effective. Regular updates in relation to this information will also be important to ensure staff remain aware of, you know, when not to come into work, the site rules in place with regards to social distancing, and also the arrangements that you've got in place with regards to hygiene, hand washing and cleaning, and collaboration between health and safety and HR teams and wider management teams in relation to communicating and consulting with the workforce will also really help in ensuring a smooth transition to the new way of working. So we spent quite a bit of time kind of talking about how you can make sure that your workplace is COVID secure and the other general health and safety issues that you will need to consider when implementing new ways of working to keep your employees safe. And I just want to move on now and spend a little bit of time looking at the HSE's approach to enforcement of the new guidelines and also their regulatory enforcement approach in general, given the current circumstances. And so before we delve too deep into this, I just wanted to highlight two primary pieces of legislation which are pertinent to this subject in terms of the management of health and safety. So firstly, the Health and Safety at Work Act is the overarching piece of legislation in relation to the management of health and safety at work, and imposes a duty on employers to protect the health, safety and welfare of their employees and any other persons affected by their work activities so far as is reasonably practicable. The second piece of legislation that I'd like to draw your attention to is the management of health and safety at work regulations. And these require employers to make suitable, sufficient assessment of workplace risks to health and safety and to identify those who might be affected by them. The identified risks must be eliminated, or where this is not reasonably practicable, controlled to reduce the likelihood of harm. And while strictly speaking, the coronavirus is not a specific work-related health hazard, the Health and Safety Executive insists that employee health and safety must remain a priority. So legal requirements in relation to risk assessment are applicable in these circumstances, and they also endorse the full implementation of the government guidance where it is applicable, and in particular the need for social distancing to be maintained. So it may be quite tempting to assume that all employers at the moment are facing quite significant challenges and difficulties in planning and implementing robust COVID-19 risk mitigation measures, such as social distancing, etc. And therefore, because everybody is facing these challenges, the likelihood of facing criminal enforcement action are quite low. However, this can be a fairly misplaced opinion, and the government has made it very clear that employers must put the health and safety of their workforce first. And employers just will not be able to get away with forcing people to work in conditions that are not COVID secure. So the government has stressed that they will be looking out for workers and are actively urging anybody who feels that their workplace is not safe to contact the Health and Safety Executive where they feel like their concerns are not being taken seriously following the initial discussions with their employer. And this is quite a very real concern for a lot of workers who are returning to work, so much so that the TUC has urged proactive enforcement of the requirements as well as strict sanctions for employers who do not comply. And the HSE seem to be in agreement with this approach, with the HSE's chief executive saying that inspectors will be ready to issue enforcement notices that will require employers to cease dangerous practices or take additional protective action with the sanction of criminal prosecution if they are ignored. So this is something that is being taken very seriously by the government and regulatory bodies, and so much so that the government has actually allocated an additional £14 million to the HSE to allow them to carry out spot checks on workplaces to check that companies are actually doing the right thing. So given this proactive enforcement approach, as well as the fact that many workers will be experiencing heightened levels of fear and anxiety, which may result in an increased possibility that they're likely to report deficiencies to the HSE or the local authority regulators. Say, for instance, in circumstances where they feel they're being pressured into returning to work without adequate mitigation measures in place at the expense of their own personal safety. It really is important that business operations are suitably planned and managed prior to bringing employees back to the workplace to make sure that those workplaces are COVID secure. And I hope that if there are only 3 things that you take away from today's session, is that you can effectively ensure that you are able to continue operating your business safely and productively through thorough risk assessment, through suitable and well thought out implementation and management of the control measures that are in line with the government's industry guidance, and also through adopting a team approach to health and safety management, which incorporates collaboration and consultation with the workforce. And finally, just before I wrap up and take some questions, I just want to make sure that I've mentioned and touched on the fact that during this time, it's also really important not to forget that your existing health and safety duties are still in place, and despite the demanding circumstances, compliance with occupational health and safety legal requirements remain with duty holders. So the HSE will continue its regulatory oversight of how duty holders are meeting their requirements under health and safety law. And in addition to this, the HSE have stated that their regulatory approach will take a flexible and proportionate account of the risks and challenges arising from the pandemic, but organisations will not be able to use the pandemic as an excuse for falling short or failing to meet their existing statutory health and safety duties or requirements. So, for instance, we've had quite a few clients ask us about the HSE's position on statutory thorough inspection of lifting equipment, for example. And the HSE have made their position quite clear on this, and that every effort should be being made to make sure that such inspection schedules are being adhered to. Social distancing guidelines shouldn't be used as a barrier to prevent contractors accessing site, and it should be possible for arrangements to be made with contractors to access the site in accordance with social distancing guidelines. If for any reason you are unable to undertake scheduled thorough examinations by the due date, the HSE has said that their usual enforcement response will be to take no action if the only failing is that the thorough examination and test is not carried out by the required date. But if equipment is used outside of its test regime, it should only be used really if you can demonstrate that it is critical for the essential work and that it can still be operated safely. So again, this points towards a risk-assessed approach here. So you must be able to demonstrate that you've made all reasonable attempts to have the thorough inspection and testing carried out, and that you've made a thorough assessment of the increased risk and taken appropriate action to manage it. So ideally, the best course of action in these situations is to not to use the equipment until the thorough examination test has been completed and the equipment is certified as safe to use if you can, wherever possible. And when you can't do that, you need to be making sure that you've implemented a thorough and robust risk assessment approach in relation to how you are managing the use of this equipment and how it's being maintained in a safe condition. So that's a brief kind of whirlwind whistle-stop tour as to how you should be kind of managing your ongoing business activities in terms of your coronavirus risks and the considerations that you should make. Well, I'll turn my video back on and we'll have a look at some of the questions that have come from here. And okay, so the first question we have from Terry said about factoring in what other household members did for a job, but you're not quite sure what to do with this information. Can you clarify? Generally, this will just help inform your risk assessment procedures. So it will give you a clearer idea of kind of how people are interacting with each other and the types of exposure risk that might happen in your workplace. So, you know, if you've got a lot of people, for example, who have people within their household that are working environments where they are exposed to a higher level of coronavirus, say for example if they work in healthcare settings or those types of things, then obviously people coming to work, maybe, you know, their exposure is probably higher and they're at a higher risk of kind of potentially being exposed to that, to the virus. So it will just help you kind of organise your work areas and try and look at maybe areas where if there are people who are particularly vulnerable, keeping them separated from people that might have had additional exposure outside of a workplace setting. Okay. So the second question we have from Peter. with regards to first aid staff who might be directly affected by the virus and may even refuse to take responsibility and additional risk on. There is actually specific guidance that's been released within specific industries. So I know for the construction industry, there's been quite significant guidance on relation to the first aid and emergency procedures that should be in place. And basically, the guidance is with regards to, you know, your first aid arrangements. Your coronavirus arrangements shouldn't stop people from giving that first aid treatment or any of your emergency arrangements. So these are the types of things that maybe you need to talk through your workforce and have a look at that risk assessment process and detail the steps that you would expect people to be taking in the event that there was a kind of a first aid emergency during, you know, this time. Okay. So the next question we have from Sandra is about contractors not coming out to do routine inspections and that you're regularly contacting them and they haven't changed their stance at the moment. So where do you stand there? So depending on kind of the systems that they're maintaining, what I would suggest that you do is look at your risk assessment. So, you know, if it's with regards to building services such as fire alarm systems, emergency lightings, looking back at your fire safety, your fire risk assessments and that type of thing, and having a look at the impact that that system not being maintained to the schedule and the routine testing, how that will impact on your overall risk assessment. And from there, are there any steps that you can take to reduce that level of risk in the interim while you're waiting for your contractors to be able to come back out onto site? And that should help. But really, in terms of if your risk assessment shows that, you know, there's a significant level of risk involved in those systems not being maintained, you should really be looking at whether the workplace should be, you know, or that specific area of the workplace should actually be brought back into operation at this time. So yeah, it will come down to your risk assessment procedure. Okay, the next question we have is from John with regards to cleaning items such as photocopiers, and is there any specific guidance in relation to this? Again, with kind of shared items of equipment and you know, tools or that type of thing, there is industry specific guidance on cleaning regimes that should be in place. Generally for items of shared equipment, the general procedures would be that you would clean it before you use it, clean it after you've used it, and then obviously put it back, and then the next person that comes would then clean it again before they use it and clean it after to really mitigate that risk of any kind of cross-contamination from various people touching the items. And that's probably the best approach to take, you know, to make sure that that person using that equipment isn't exposed to any risk. Okay, so the next question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that teaching and training environments for trades can be facilitated safely at this moment in time? Again, that will come down to your risk assessment. So if you can maintain the social distancing measures within those environments, then yes. If there are instances, again, where you might not be able to maintain that distance for certain parts of the training, it will then come down to the risk assessment and the measures that we talked about earlier in terms of mitigating that transmission risk in those particular circumstances. But yes, if the 2 metre distancing can be maintained, then by all means the teaching and training should be able to go ahead. Okay, the next question. So Katie has asked, presumably where you bring in social distancing or equipment rules in the workplace and employees in that office area choose to ignore the rules because they don't seem deem it to not be a risk, or because in practice it becomes unworkable, employers can enforce these rules as they would any other health and safety requirements. Yeah, that's right. And the bit that we talked about earlier about communicating and consulting with your workforce is where this becomes, really helpful. So where employees can understand why you've introduced a certain procedure and why they need to carry out the measures that you're asking them to carry out, and they understand them properly, people are a lot more willing to comply with those rules and those requirements. But yeah, if again, as we said earlier, health and safety duties haven't changed in this situation. So employers' duties haven't changed, but also employees' duties haven't changed either. So employees still do have that duty and responsibility to abide by any health and safety rules that employers put in place to manage their own health and safety at work. The next question is from George and is about they are due their 5-year electrical test, and given that contractors are not all working, where is the guidance with regards to this, and how would this play out with insurers? So the HSE standpoint at this moment in time is previously what we touched on. So you should do everything within your power to try and make sure that those testing regimes can be maintained. And in the event of an incident, you will be required to demonstrate that you've done everything within your power to try and make sure that those schedules are adhered to. If those schedules can't be adhered to for whatever reason, because contractors aren't coming out, or they're in demand at the moment, then it will come down to a risk assessed approach in terms of how you're managing that risk. In terms of how it would play out with insurers, it's probably something that you would want to take up individually with your insurers and see what their kind of stance is given the current environment and the current situation. But in terms of the HSE, that approach of trying to get the testing done and then risk assessing any potential issues will be kind of your next port of call. Another question with regards to hygiene or social distancing matters about if employees don't comply, can it become a disciplinary matter? Yes, it can. It's probably something that I would point you in the direction of your HR teams, or kind of a HR advisor who'd be able to advise you a little bit more in terms of kind of the disciplinary procedures that you can implement. But employees do have a responsibility under health and safety law to make sure that they are following any rules that employers put in place. And again, like I said earlier, making sure that people are consulted on this and you try and adopt more of a team approach to this will hopefully get rid of some of that kind of resistance to adhering to the guidelines and the rules and procedures that you are putting in place. Okay, the next question from Sophie is with regards to how to deal with requests from staff who require employees to provide face masks for them in order to take public transport to go to work. This is a little bit of a strange one really, and I'll probably have to do a little bit of research on this and come back to you. So, generally, people coming to work or using public transport to work would fall outside of the requirements for organisations to kind of manage that aspect of a worker's health and safety, although a lot of the guidance now is actually requiring some businesses to take that into account when managing their risks. So I will kind of look into that a little bit more detail and provide some answers to that in kind of FAQ after this webinar. Next question from Katie, saying that first aiders may be furloughed and first aid training is unavailable. Should you unfurlough first aiders for this purpose? Now again, this will come down to looking at your existing first aid needs risk assessment. So the first aid provision that you require will vary depending on what kind of industry that you're in, and what kind of work environment you are working in. So I would recommend that you would dig out your first aid needs assessment and have a look there as to what kind of first aid provision you feel that is necessary in the workforce. And if you are working on kind of reduced staff, you know, does the first aid provision, is it okay for now, or do you need to actually increase it? And then looking at the procedures that you would need to maybe implement to make sure that you do have that adequate first aid provision on site. And obviously it will be especially important if you are working in an industry where people are doing high risk operations. So yeah. So Nikki has asked a question about managing a business centre, and saying, whilst this webinar has covered employers' responsibilities, will compliance state that I have a responsibility to every user of the building? Again, the roles and responsibilities in relation to kind of your existing health and safety responsibilities are unchanged in this situation. So any existing roles and responsibilities that you had previously will remain the same. So if under health and safety law previously you had a responsibility, that responsibility will remain. So yeah, if that was there before, then yes, it will remain. A question from Catherine about how do you address situations for staff who may report being anxious, even though you have done what you can to minimise the risk for them. And I think this is quite a common problem that employers are facing, where people are, you know, there's a lot of fear at the moment, and people's emotions in returning to the workplace is heightened. And I think that, you know, that communication with your employees and letting them have an involvement in you know, talking about where they perceive the hazards and the risks to be and what they feel should be in place to make sure that they feel safe and supported in that work environment should really help to kind of mitigate some of that fear and anxiety that people have with regards to coming back to work. So yeah, ensuring that those channels of communication are open, that you're listening to your employees and you're taking on board any concerns that they might have, and explaining to them kind of what you've done to make sure that you are putting their health and safety first and making sure that they're not going to be put in a situation where they are at risk. Richard has asked how many people are allowed in a small team. So I'm assuming this is with regards to people that are working within 2 meters of each other. Again, this should be minimised to as small as possible, so that as small as you can possibly get, really. And when people are working within 2 meters of each other, you want to kind of minimise that time to an absolute minimum that they are spending, particularly kind of within that 2 meter environment and face to face. So a small team, and probably not being too helpful with not being able to give you a number, but it should be as small as possible to minimise the number of people that are exposed to that increased level of risk. So next question from Mark. So what about keeping some fire doors open during working hours, providing additional measures are taken to reduce the transmission of coronavirus? Again, go back to your fire risk assessment for the premises, have a look at what effect that keeping those fire doors open will have on kind of the effect on your overall fire risk assessment, and see if that, you know, that level of risk is acceptable in those circumstances. Next question from Kelly, asking, when you get contractors in, should we be asking to see their policies, risk assessments with regards to coronavirus? So yeah, so really when you have contractors in any way, you should be asking them for risk assessments with regards to the work activities that they're doing. And so yeah, you should, you know, ask them to ask for their risk assessments with regards to coronavirus. But you should also be informing contractors about the arrangements that you have in place and the procedures that you will be expecting them to follow when they do get on site, as well as maybe some kind of prior screening to check that they haven't kind of got any symptoms or been exposed to any kind of in any work environments where coronavirus is present. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So question from Catherine. Would it be helpful for an individual to prepare a personal risk assessment taking into account their experiences during lockdown, the potential for increased anxiety and their circumstances regarding shielding for others? Yeah, so all that type of information will really help inform kind of a risk assessment procedure, and obviously will give you a good idea as to kind of individual circumstances and how people are managing these risks differently. So yeah, that would be helpful. Okay, next question from Tony. Do employees undertaking testing need to advise our health and safety coordinator that they're doing so? I will have to kind of get back to you with regards to this. I know that there is a requirement, obviously, that employees will have to disclose it, you know, if they have any symptoms to their health and safety or their management team. So I would imagine if they're undertaking a test because they have coronavirus symptoms and suspect that they have coronavirus, then yes, it's something really that they should be telling their teams. But again, that type of information, the HR people will be able to kind of advise you a little bit further on to, you know, the actual people aspect of that. I think the last question that we have time for, what if an employee has an underlying health condition and not shared with the employer? So again, employees can only do what they're aware of, and it is an employee's, you know, responsibility to make sure that they make their employer aware of any kind of health and safety issues related to themselves. If they choose not to disclose that, then there's not really much an employer can do in those situations. And again, it's kind of entwined with HR issues. And so those types of issues, you probably want to have a little bit of a kind of chat between the health and safety and your HR teams to make sure that any issues like that are being dealt with. So I think that's all we've got time for today. There were a few questions that I didn't actually get round to answering. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that they're answered in a kind of FAQ document that will go out with this webinar recording and any kind of information that we send out. So thank you all again for attending today's webinar. I hope you found it useful, and if there's any feedback or comments or you need any further advice or guidance, then please don't hesitate to drop me a line and get in touch. Thank you.